Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to the public defense by Ms. Piyanit board of her thesis entitled Competitive Challenges and Cluster Responses. A special welcome to Ms. Poradipol's family and friends, her mother, her sister and brother, and to the Second Secretary of the Royal Thai Embassy representing the ambassador. Of course, you have all switched off your telephones, but would you check one more time to see whether that is correct? Thank you. I declare the meeting open, and I bid you, Ms. Piyanit, most heartily welcome. You may now give a brief exposition of your research, of your reasons for having undertaken it, and the results it has yielded.
Mr. Writer Magnificus, good afternoon, Rector, the examining committee, my promoters, and distinguished guests. My thesis focuses on cluster policy and how clusters in East and Southeast Asia deal with competitive challenges. In my presentation today, I will begin by giving a brief background of my interest and area of research. In today's globalized era, the cluster approach has attracted attention of policymakers, business leaders, and academicians in many countries, especially developing countries, as a key strategy for industrial development. Thailand has also implemented the cluster approach to enhance its competitiveness since 2002. As a policy analyst in the National Planning Agency of Thailand, I have been involved with cluster development since its inception and experienced many problems in the cluster policy process, which obstructed its progress and effectiveness. I will draw an analogy here of a cluster and a football team. Like a football team, a cluster comprises many players who are skillful in playing a particular position. Each player cannot play alone to win the match. They have to cooperate towards the same goal. Cluster development is a novel approach to develop industries toward high competitiveness. A cluster comprises many actors, including businesses along a supply chain and supporting organizations such as government agencies, research and educational institutes, and trade associations. Each cluster actor has its own specialization. They are interdependent and need to cooperate to achieve a common goal, that is competitiveness. Cluster approach encourages them to use their specializations to generate collective proficiency. However, it does not limit competition. While cooperating, cluster actors also compete with each other, but more towards improving their capabilities and quality of goods and services. Therefore, cluster policy can be constructed as part of an industrial policy. It provides a more effective way to conduct microeconomic policy of nations and facilitates towards a better constructive and efficient platform for business government dialogue and collaboration. Based on my practical experiences on cluster policy, a major motivation for conducting this research was to know the condition or context that and the mechanisms for successful implementation of cluster policy and how clusters can better deliver solutions to cope with their challenges. At the same time, some gaps in the cluster theory further encourages me towards this research. Cluster is a process, not a project. However, policymakers often overlook the process and mechanism of cluster development, and field studies focus on the process and dynamics of cluster development. As we know, Michael Porter's cluster theory does emphasize the role of institutional processes in enhancing cluster competitiveness. However, it does not clearly explain why and under what conditions clusters decide to apply a particular mechanism to deal with their critical issues. In addition, Most of cluster studies focus only on one or two dimensions of cluster. None of them analyzes cluster development mechanisms by multiple factors with a holistic view. And very few studies compare clusters in different sectors, especially between high-tech and traditional ones, and those in different national policy contexts. This research aims to fill in this gap in cluster theory and cluster policy studies by developing a holistic analytical framework for cluster policy analysis to improve policy process for cluster development. This study attempts to answer three main questions. The first question focuses on the interplay of three main elements, including context, cluster characteristic, and cluster governance, and how this interplay affects the institutional modality of cluster intervention or how the clusters deal with their competitive challenges. The second one focuses on institutional modalities of cluster intervention and investigates the context and conditions in which such modality can be effectively implemented. Finally, the last question deals with lessons learned from the comparison of the case studies. In terms of methodology, I have used a comparison of case studies comprising 7 clusters in 3 sectors in 3 economies. The first sector is the electronic sector, comprising the Thai hard disk drive cluster, the Taiwanese semiconductor cluster, and the Malaysian electronic cluster. Second is the automotive and auto parts, where clusters from Thailand and Malaysia were compared. Lastly, I took the orchid sector, where Thailand and Taiwan were compared. The comparison was done to examine clusters in the same sector, but across different national contexts, and across sector within the same national context. The holistic analytical framework was designed to analyze cluster case studies comprising 5 key elements. First, context and external factors. An analysis of this element applied the business system theory originated by Richard Whitley. The business system theory focuses on interrelationships between various institutional factors, economic activities, and business organization and coordination. It helps to explain the interrelation between the national context and interaction among cluster actors. The second element is cluster characteristic. The analysis here concentrates on 2 elements. First, nature of industry, and second, structure of cluster. The nature of industry shapes specific context that influences the cluster structure and behavior and relationships of firms and other parties involved in the cluster. Cluster characteristics have an influence on how clusters are governed, which is the third element in the framework, cluster governance. Cluster governance is linked to power and control relations among actors in the clusters within existing structures and institutions. This study focuses on the interactions among key cluster actors and their capabilities. In turn, cluster characteristics and cluster governance have an effect on how clusters respond to their competitive challenges, also called in this study institutional modalities of cluster intervention. When facing a challenge to their competitiveness, cluster could deal with it by several types of interventions, such as public action, private joint action, collective action through industry association or public-private partnerships. Finally, to have a holistic picture of the cluster policy, this framework also incorporates the element of effectiveness of institutional modality based on the notion of Denny Roddick, stating that identifying the right process is more crucial in industrial development than specifying the outcome. The analysis of this element highlights process effectiveness rather than outcome effectiveness. Having given the contextual background, motivation of this study, and methodology used, I will now explain my research findings. This study revealed three main sets of findings. The first set is related to the relationships between cluster characteristics and cluster governance. The context of clusters can influence cluster structure and governance in three aspects. First, clusters having a similar nature of industry are likely to have a similar structure due to the influence of industry-specific context. The nature of fast-changing technology of technology-driven clusters forces local firms that are weak in technological capability to largely being dominated by foreign multinational corporations. In contrast, the natural resource-based clusters basically rely on local resources and tacit knowledge. This allows many local firms to be involved in the clusters and limits the presence of foreign firms. Second, cluster governance is likely to be aligned with industrial structure of clusters. This aspect can be seen in both technology-driven and natural resource-based clusters. Third, country-specific context can alter the cluster structure and governance from the expected type, shaped by industry-specific context through the government intervention in local capabilities. Due to the differences of government policy and national context, the structures of Taiwanese semiconductor and the Malaysian automotive and auto parts cluster are different from other technology-driven clusters. They are dominated by large national firms and local suppliers. Furthermore, this research also found the relationships between cluster governance and institutional modality of cluster intervention. The analysis reveals that it is not necessary that clusters operating in the same sector, facing a similar competitive challenge, and having a similar form of governance select the same institutional modality to tackle their challenges. Therefore, this finding contradicts the business system theory, which discusses that form of economic coordination of businesses operating in a similar business system or national context tend to be alike. Another key finding is that the differences in the level of effectiveness of institutional modality of cluster intervention can be attributed to at least three factors. First, the difference in industrial nature and business system. Influence of industrial nature combining the lack of government support in the past allowed local entrepreneurs in the Thai and Taiwanese orchid cluster to play more vital role in driving cluster development. Interestingly, the high quality of human capital, technology infrastructure, and supporting institutions in the Taiwanese business systems enable its semiconductor and orchid clusters to overcome their challenges effectively, though their industrial natures are totally different. The second factor is characteristic of a core agency for cluster coordination. The analysis reveals that clusters driven by a private initiated agency seems to be more effective in implementing their institutional modalities, as in the case of the Thai and the Taiwanese orchid clusters. The third factor is type of competitive challenge and presence or absence of key actors. The lack of active participation of educational sector in the Thai hard disk drive and Thai automotive parts cluster and Malaysian electronic cluster lower the degree of effectiveness of their institutional modalities in dealing with the challenge of human resource and skill development. Most importantly, this research contributes three lessons learned to improve cluster policy process. The first one is related to policy formulation. This study found that clusters in different stages of development require different policy supports. Hence, policymakers need to take into account to formulate cluster policy that suits the developmental stage of each cluster. The second lesson is about policy implementation. This study found that to successfully develop a cluster, the essence is not merely the matter of what strategy is applied, but also when the strategy should be implemented. Government needs to concentrate on the sequence in implementing selective cluster policies at the right time. Moreover, beyond creating sound business environment for the clusters to grow competitively, the main roles of the government is to strengthen local firms' adaptability in fast-changing global context and to support capability upgrading of local institutions. Finally, in the evaluation of cluster policy, the government needs to focus more on assessing process effectiveness of cluster development to gain more insight into how cluster development can successfully be promoted. I expect the result of this study is going to benefit cluster policy makers and practitioners to improve cluster policy process, leading to a more effective cluster development. Thank you very much.